I think markets can deliver reliability and can deliver the outcomes that people want, but the necessary conditions have to be satisfied.
That's Gordon van Welie, outgoing CEO of ISO New England, a man who spent 25 years at the center of one of America's most complex power markets. As we head into another winter, and as energy demand and policy pressures grow nationwide, what can we learn from New England's experience? Welcome to Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, EPSA's president and CEO. In this episode, we sit down with Gordon van Welie, who has led ISO New England since 2000, guiding the region through fuel constraints, new market designs, and an evolving policy landscape. We'll talk about what's worked in competitive markets, what hasn't, and what lessons the rest of the country can take as we confront rising demand, AI growth, electrification, and the challenge of keeping the lights on through every season. Let's dive in. To start, I asked Gordon to take us back to the early days of restructuring, when New England first unbundled its utilities and launched competitive markets. Gordon, thank you for taking time to join us today. We're certainly grateful to have the opportunity to talk with you. And as we were talking before we started, there's a lot of ground to cover. So we're going to jump right in. You've led the ISO in New England for more than 20 years now. And looking back, we've covered a lot of ground between the beginning and where we are today. What was the power sector like, and what was the region's power mix like when you first stepped into the role? And really, what motivated the shift towards competitive markets in the region? And frankly, what convinced you and others that this model would actually work? That seems to be a question we're having to answer more than we used to.
I think that's a fair observation, Todd. I joined the ISO in 2000, 25 years ago. New England had already decided to restructure by the time I joined. They set up the ISO in 1997 and launched what was called the interim market in 1999. And I think, to be fair, we got off to a shaky start. So that interim market wasn't working that well. It had stability issues. So I missed the start of the restructuring. But I know the reason for the region deciding to restructure was that policymakers and regulators had become disenchanted with the prior system. The prior system was a system of vertically integrated utilities in New England who had collaborated to build out the power system over the prior 3 decades. And there were big cost overruns on the nuclear build-out. So actually comparable to what we're seeing today in recent build-outs are both conventional nuclear reactors as well as the SMRs. And so that led people to say, there's got to be a better way, more efficient way of doing this. And restructuring of every industry was the vogue back then. So it was decided to restructure and unbundle the industry. Interestingly enough, in New England, it quickly became the most unbundled and restructured region in the nation. So more than 90% of the generation is in private merchant hands in New England, and that's because the utilities were required to sell off their generation. So that it didn't happen quite as dramatically as that across other regions. You sort of have a mix of both vertically integrated and unbundled states in the other regions. So what that then led to was the ultimate standing up of this new market that I described, the LMP-based market. That was the start of a run of great efficiencies that were produced, attracted tens of billions of dollars of private capital into the markets on both the supply and the demand side. And we went a long way in terms of achieving some of the efficiencies that were envisaged, but there were also things that we learned along the way that we had assumed away at the start of the journey. I think, nobody knew what they didn't know at the time. Stuff we've been struggling with the last 25 years, I think related to the simplifying assumptions that were made at the start of the journey.
I think that's a great starting point for our conversation. So when you look across that journey that we've been on, from early capacity markets, moves to LMP pricing, pay for performance, and now DAISY, what do you think are the examples that show how best markets can deliver reliability, which is kind of table stakes, that's what everyone expects, but also the affordability and the investment that you mentioned when they're designed well? Because every market, it seems, today is experiencing some form of, we've got to improve upon where we've been because the world has changed. But there's been some things that have gone well over the last 25 years. And kind of as you look ahead, do you think we're on a trajectory where markets will deliver? Because that seems to be one of the other favorite criticisms is markets were designed for flat periods of demand, no real load growth, and now the world has changed and maybe markets aren't up to the challenge, which of course it won't surprise our listeners or you that we disagree with that, but I'm curious what your perspective is.
I think markets can deliver reliability and can deliver the outcomes that people want, but the necessary conditions have to be satisfied. So I'll just preface it with that, because I think where you see markets struggling today, it's because those conditions haven't been satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
Or what might be behind the conditions not having been satisfied is the fact that there were assumptions made that haven't been realized adequately in the journey. If you give me a moment, I just want to go back to the original premise of the markets, because when these markets were restructured, there were a lot of smart people involved, and some leading economists at the time sort of set up the framework, the theoretical markets. And I think it's important to understand that original theory and the original premise to understand where we deviated from that, or where we made assumptions that perhaps were not realistic.
Sure.
So the original theory of this was that the ISOs would run these spot energy markets. And so what the ISOs would do would be clearing these markets. You would have locational based pricing. The price in the market would be set by the marginal unit.
Mm-hmm.
It was also the assumption that you would be able to price scarcity, and that all the revenue that would be required in order to achieve resource adequacy would be contained in that energy market. So that's sort of the starting premise.
Right.
Related to that was the fact, or the assumption, that load and supply, or consumers and suppliers, would contract bilaterally. So the spot price was a way of telling people what the instant supply and demand conditions were, but that ultimately consumers would seek out suppliers bilaterally and buy what they needed and contract bilaterally for what they needed, or build their own if that's what it took, but ultimately hedge themselves.
Yep.
And, it's the same behavior as you see in financial markets. So nobody expects the S&P 500 index fund to sort of protect everybody. It's just pricing what's happening in the daily markets. So here comes some of the assumptions that were made. The first assumption was that people would behave in this way. And it became clear that was not the case. And as powerful as competition is, and it drives efficiencies, there's also the dark side of this, which is, to the extent you have a shared system, there will always be some set of the actors in the marketplace, both on the supply and the demand side, who will choose to cut corners in some way, right? And so that can create a socialized risk to the system as a whole. So how do you discipline all of that? In the early markets that were set up, which were just energy markets, very early on, there were scarcity events where prices rose to $6,000, $7,000 per megawatt hour. That created a lot of alarm and anxiety in Washington and amongst the states. And what came about as a result of that were caps in the energy markets. So I'll just deviate for a moment to say that if you speak to Matt White, our VP of Market Design, he'll tell you that the implied price in the energy market for our 1 day in 10 reliability standard in New England is $110,000 per megawatt hour. So that's what it takes to get to the resource adequacy standard that one needs, that's been specified by NERC and NPCC. So if you're capping the energy market at $1,000, which is what happened back then, the caps have gone up a little bit since then, in like $2,000 to $3,000 range. It begets the question of, well, where's the money coming from in terms of assuring resource adequacy? Then you load in another complexity, which is there was an assumption made, which also turned out to be wrong, that externalities would be priced, right? And so what we discovered along the way over this 2.5 decade journey was that was a very difficult thing to accomplish. And policymakers would tend not to want to do that because of the impacts on pricing.
Correct.
And so the lack of the price caps in the energy market, coupled with the externalities not being priced, resulted in what's termed the missing money. And that led to the need to pay that missing
I'm going to
money.
have to ask you to put a dollar into our things we don't say jar, Gordon, but that's exactly what it was labeled.
So it was labeled the missing money. And so now there's a conundrum, which is how do you achieve resource adequacy if there's not enough money in the market to achieve it, right? So you now have to have some kind of solution to that. And you are immediately forced into the workaround space. And what came out of the Northeast markets in that workaround space were capacity markets.
Right.
There's another way of solving this, which is to try and put the obligation on load-serving entities in some way and have them effectively pay that money through bilateral contracts in some way. And that you can see in the MISO and SPP constructs. The irony of this was there's only 10 to 20% of the revenue that flows through the capacity markets. Yet
Right.
it creates 80% of the angst and the drama. I say all of that just to sort of create the theoretical backdrop for what people are sort of fiercely arguing over.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at what's worked superbly well, the energy markets and the ancillary services markets have really worked well to optimize the daily production of electricity. Nobody fights about that. And if there are disagreements, it's really on the margin.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so those are really worked famously well. And LMP-based markets have been adopted all over the planet now as sort of the leading edge, best practice way of optimizing data production. The thing that is still always debated is how does one achieve resource adequacy? And then you quickly get into the views of who should have control over those mechanisms and so forth, and how much interference there should be. My other observation is that the reality is that any resource adequacy construct, I don't care which one it is, and I've looked all over the world at these things, are administrative in nature in some way. And so that creates an incentive system for people in the marketplace, whether you're on the supply or the demand side of it, to send in armies of people to go and argue about all the assumptions and all the rule sets around those administrative constructs. So that's where the friction and the angst comes from. I think if you look around, some regions and places have done a better job of working out a collaborative solution around how one designs these constructs than in other regions. And I think that's an evolutionary process. Hopefully it will work out eventually in an equally good way, but it's going to be hard to live through those periods of turbulence.
That was a remarkably diplomatic way of saying the stakeholder process can be a little bit messy, but you said it very nicely.
I wanted to give you that backdrop because a lot of my comments derive from that.
So as you look across where we've been, what are the moments that best show markets can deliver? Because we're hearing that markets can't deliver in a period of load growth, which we have not really experienced in 25 years. And now we're experiencing it in spades in some parts of the country. And so the criticism is, well, even a well-designed market isn't going to deliver. And as I mentioned, we would disagree with that. But of course, you run the market. So how do you think about that?
Okay, so the market can deliver, and it comes back to what I started with saying if the necessary conditions are in place. So we've seen the market deliver over the last 25 years. Tens of billions of dollars of investment, and touch wood, New England has done well from a reliability point of view. We've had some close calls, and those close calls have led to market improvements like the pay for performance construct. But generally, you can look back and say, what is the original premise achieved in terms of producing efficiencies and shifting risk away from consumers to investors? And I think the answer to that is yes. Now you ask the next question, which is looking forward, can these markets continue to deliver? And I'll come back to my point of yes, providing the necessary context is in place. And this is really what was behind my comments to Congress in March and to the first at the June technical conference. The first bit of context here, which is critically important, is there has to be alignment between federal and state policy. Investors in the end are going to invest based on their belief that they'll be able to put their money into the market and get it back over time. If there's great uncertainty around the alignment of policy, either amongst states or between the states and the federal government, that makes for a much more uncertain world from an investment point of view. People are going to be more reluctant to put their money in. And it's more expensive, but it'll be the brave investor if they think, well, this current set of policy direction is taking us in this direction, but it might change 3 years from now. So am I going to plow a bunch of money into this only to find myself with the rug pulled out from underneath me 3 years from now, right? So that's what investors think about. And so how do they hedge that? They go looking for a certainty in the form of longer term commitments. That's how they do it. If you're looking for that certainty from the actual system operator, you're starting to undermine the original premise of the market because you're making the market lean more and more on the system operator and the market designer as the counterparty rather than having that occur bilaterally between suppliers and sellers. So that's the first bit of context, good alignment between federal and state policy. Then going back to that original theoretical construct, given that there's a need to solve for resource adequacy, each region's got to go figure out what their construct is. And through some stakeholder process, figure out what that is. The states have to have a say in this because they need to own whatever construct comes out of that stakeholder process and support it, right? And so in the Northeast markets, it happens to be the capacity markets. There are other mechanisms elsewhere. But if you look around the planet, really, but even here in the US, my observation is the markets that are working the best right now are the ones where the stakeholders, the ISO and the states have worked out what they want as a solution. It might not always be the most elegant solution or the most pure solution from an economic theory perspective, but they figured it out and they figured out how they want to make it work. And so that leads me back to the last point here, which, you heard me use the word joint and complementary role between the ISO and the states. Having chosen a resource adequacy construct, then it's incumbent on the ISO or the RTO to design and operate that construct on behalf of the region to the best of its abilities, make sure that the market design is as efficient as possible. And then I think the states have a role because the states ultimately control siting and permitting. And another thing that will cause a market not to work very well is if there are undue barriers to entry or frictions in the system. Because the idea of a market is you put out a price signal to cause buyers and sellers to contract with each other financially or otherwise, but you need to be able to build stuff in order to get the entry that you're looking for if the demand goes up. We're in a build phase. We've got to build very quickly. And yet we observe there are many frictions in the system, both in terms of supply chain frictions as well as frictions with regard to siting and permitting. That's not going to result in a great outcome if you don't do something about those frictions. And then the last point I'd make is there are different types of consumers in the market. There are big industrials and commercial consumers who are sophisticated and big enough to take care of themselves. And then there are going to be the end use retail consumers who are not sophisticated and can't be thinking every day about how do they hedge themselves. And they also happen to be voters. And so
kind of an important data point.
A very important data point. And so voters get very anxious if they see their costs being very volatile. And they express those anxieties to their elected officials, who then have a strong incentive to try and steer outcomes in the wholesale market. So the quickest way to lose confidence in wholesale market constructs is if end consumers are anxious about their electricity bills. And so the way to solve for that is those folks need to be hedged in some way to smooth out the volatility, because it's the sudden movements in price that are the biggest issue, not the gradual movements. And I think we lost sight of that. And there's been a lot of back and forth about who should be hedging what. The thing I point out, it should not ever be the system operator's job to be hedging end consumers. And so I think that's where the states have a role. I think that's where the distribution companies have a role. And I think we've sort of lost sight of that. And unfortunately, in those regions where we have the capacity markets, I think there's too much reliance on the capacity markets. So how we gradually restore some balance in that equation, I think is fundamental to whether these markets will produce the results that we're looking for. So to come back to your question then, if we can make sure that the contextual ingredients are satisfied, the markets will do their job in an efficient way. If those ingredients are not there, then we're not going to have great outcomes.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. We're a wholesale generator organization, but the retail side of the business does allow consumers to hedge by signing a fixed contract for a period of time. And we've been kind of having conversations around the lack of hedging when you're in an ever declining price environment, which abruptly stopped. And now we're in a higher price environment as we've seen capacity auctions begin to turn in the other direction. And there are critics who are saying that that's a failure of the market. And I would say that perhaps the thing to do would have been to hedge when you were at very low prices in order to protect yourself from what could be a longer term increase. I mean, 2 years ago, we were sort of talking about data centers. Now we can't walk to the men's room without talking about data centers and load growth. And so the world has changed in that relatively short period of time. Certainly in an industry where you make 40-year investments, it's been a pretty quick turn about how we're thinking about things. And so your point's a fair one. And we would agree that the bilateral approach is going to have to be required, especially as we look at how we're going to move more quickly, how you can insulate consumers from some of the costs on data centers, and how the market will respond. Because I share your optimism that given the right instructions, the market participants will deliver the outcomes that we want, but we've got to be explicit about what we're asking them to do.
Yeah, and you made the good point that for a period of several decades here, we were in a period of low load growth and surplus generation capacity in the system. And the markets worked brilliantly to optimize that and squeeze the fat out of the system. And then fairly quickly changed and moved in the other direction. So, from a demand point of view, from a consumer point of view, whether you were the end consumer or the commercial industrial, you could take a short position in the market. And it worked out fine because prices were trending down. Now what's happened is things have quickly moved in the other direction. And if you haven't taken a longer position in the market, then you're exposed to the high prices.
Exactly right.
And my observation is this is now a conundrum that both federal and state policies are faced with.
Mm-hmm.
That, people look at election cycles and say, this is not a great outcome if I'm going to win the next election, whatever that is, midterm or the next presidential election. And so we also know that price volatility is not great in the political space. The second problem is we know that supply chains are super stretched right now. So whether you're talking about generation or talking about the power transformers for the transmission system and the HVDC cables and so forth, all of these things are backlogged with very multi-year backlogs. So how do you now solve for a situation where you want to build things quickly, but you don't want to have price volatility? That's the political conundrum. And so I think that's going to require some creativity. And I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all creative solution to that. I think every region is going to have to figure that out for themselves. My observation is if you look around, you can sort of see people becoming creative. They're solving for this in a way that fits their regional policy constraints. But I think it's going to drive the theorists a little crazy because we're going to be in workaround space here for a while, in the sense that it's not going to look like the economic textbooks say that it should look.
That's kind of the old adage, right? Economics works great until people get involved. And so the textbook has the answer, but human behavior does have an impact.
And it's very important to have the textbook because you need to know what, it's the compass.
That's right.
It's telling you where true north is and what you should be designing towards. And then you are then in the mode of saying, okay, we've got this set of realities we've got to deal with. What are the hopefully minor deviations you have to take away from true north in order to work our way through this situation? So I think a very long-winded way of saying, I think we're in an unprecedented time. I don't think anyone has got the obvious solution. I think each region is going to have to figure it out and take some responsibility for making sure that there are decent outcomes within their region. I am optimistic, though, that people will find a way to work with each other to make this work, but it's going to require, I think, maturity on all sides in this conversation to orchestrate a collaborative solution that works out for everyone.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. And you've kind of already led into my next question, which is New England's a bit of a microcosm, right? You faced all kinds of things during your tenure there: fuel constraints, aggressive decarbonization goals, electrification, transmission and siting bottlenecks, evolving market designs that we've been talking about now for a bit. Do you view that as making you a bit of a test case for maybe a national policy, or what can other regions learn from you? Because I think we share your sentiment. Every region is a bit different. The fuel mix is different, the politics is different, but we're all aiming towards that same system reliability at a cost-effective way to deliver that to consumers. So how do you think about that from what New England's been able to learn and then show others? And then what should other regions be taking from what the work that you've done there is maybe applicable in your region, given that there will be regional differences? There are some things that are transferable. Do you have thoughts about what those might be?
I've had the benefit of doing this now for 25 years, and I'd first of all say that there's a great deal of collaboration amongst the ISOs and each other all the time in all the functional disciplines, sharing what we're doing in the area of market design or planning or operation. So there's a lot of cross-pollination that occurs. I'd also say that from a New England perspective, given our starting point, we're a relatively small region, and as you pointed out, lots and lots of constraints, we have a pretty practical, pragmatic mindset, I'd say. And if we see a good idea that somebody else has invented, we're not afraid to copy it and implement it and be a fast follower rather than try to be a leader.
Sure.
The first example of that was when we were struggling to stand up those first markets. We came up with the idea to copy the PJM design. And a period of just over 2 years, we implemented a new market for $78 million. By contrast, if you look at what happened later in California and Texas, they spent $1 billion each putting up the markets, right? And so we were able to leverage what PJM had already invented, have it be consistent, have a set of market rules that were consistent with software that already worked, and stood up that market pretty quickly. Another example would be where we liberally copied the cost benefit methodology from MISO, the multi-value project methodology around transmission, and leverage that into our long-term transmission planning process that the states and the ISO worked out in the last couple of years. So there are two examples of where we have been pragmatic and just taken a good idea from somewhere else. But then to your point, there were other things that we encountered first that nobody else encountered. So there was no way to copy somebody else's solution. We had to forced to innovate. And one of the things that became very visible early on was that we were quite constrained when it came to the availability of gas in the wintertime. So the markets were famously bringing all of this new investment in gas compliant cycles. And literally within 5 or 6 years, we hit the capacity limit of the pipeline delivery of that gas into New England. I remember very vividly, I think it was around 2004-ish, one cold January morning, we had half our gas fleet calling in sick and say, we can't find gas, right? So that's not a great day.
No.
Then the fleet that you're relying on says they don't have fuel. And that was the beginning journey that we were on, and we're still not fully solved for that problem. So we're one of the most energy constrained regions in the country. That has caused us to innovate over and over again around this issue, both in terms of market design as well as our various operational practices. And it's caused the region to rely on workarounds. So when the gas pipelines get constrained, we switch to burning imported LNG and oil, and that's very expensive, arguably more polluting than pipeline gas, but that's practically what we've had to do. I'll use one example here of a thing that we had to invent that others may have copied. We had to put in much stronger incentives around making sure that generators firmed up their fuel supply. So the first example of that, after we had the near miss event in 2013-14, where we got to a point where in the winter, one of the winter storms, we were down to 2 days of fuel in New England. We came up with pay for performance, which was later adopted by PJM, and I know generators hated it, but it is still a very necessary ingredient in the market, because you need to have people understand there's a consequence if you don't do something about firming fuel. If you tell the ISO that you've taken on an obligation and then you can't deliver on the day, there has to be some financial consequence to that in order to make people change their behavior.
Correct.
So I think what was brilliant about, give Matt White the credit for this, the pay for performance concept, is whether it set up the capacity product as a call option on energy. And then Matt later brought the same thinking into the design of the ancillary services market. We've just implemented something called DAISY, and we've got an options-based ancillary services market as well. And so those contracts do two things. Not only do they help ensure proper price formation and that people are pricing the true cost of firming up the fuel and putting their risk into the market offer, but also ultimately it also creates strong incentives for people to perform. And we've seen that work out. So given that we're the most heavily energy constrained region in the country, we've not had any major issues yet, knock on wood.
Right.
And so that, I think, is a consequence of good market design and strong incentives. We've had a long list of first, we're the first ones to have priced losses in addition to congestion into the NMPs. We weren't the first to do a capacity market, but we were the first to put in the MRI curves. We're going to be the first to put in gas constraints. All of these were driven really by our unique situation that we had to deal with. But what has been interesting for me is that many of the things that cropped up first here in New England are starting to emerge elsewhere in the country as well. For a long time, our colleagues in other parts of the country were not worried about gas constraints, but suddenly
we are,
right? And so I'll bridge into a point here that hasn't been adequately solved for, which is the gas and the electric systems are now completely interdependent.
You want to come back and do another podcast about gas electric?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Boy, could we do that.
I'd love to go on about that, but suffice to say, different business models, different regulatory structures. It's as if these systems are still being regulated in silos as if they're not interdependent, which is the way they started 30, 40 years ago, but they have become completely interdependent. And so the way we plan the gas system is completely different from the way the electric system is planned. And the way you pay for the gas system is completely different to the way the electric system is paid. And yet we're expecting the system to work harmonious, right? This integrated system. And shockingly, it's not. Right?
Spoiler alert, it's not working as well as it could.
It's not working as well as we would like it to. I think so. The problem then becomes, well, what do you do with it? I think there needs to be some regulatory reform in this space. It's probably going to take congressional action, which may be a long time coming. And so in the absence of that, you're in workaround space. And I think, once again, the extent of the workaround is going to depend on the extent of the constraint. And so I'll come back to another area where we're a first mover, which is we're modeling the gas constraints in our redesigned capacity market. So we've decided a forward capacity market is not an annual forward capacity market is not the right solution for where we're going. We're moving to a prompt seasonal market with marginal capacity accreditation, and we are layering into that a gas constraint that will be cleared as part of that auction. And that's really just because of our unique situation. And whether or not that becomes something that is adopted by others, I think will depend on how long there's this stasis in this regulatory gap that I described earlier on.
The list is longer. I mean, I recalled many of those, but not the entire list that you offered of the innovative approaches that have been taken in order to try and address the North Star, as you describe it. Yeah, ultimately, we would love the economic textbook to be the model, but you have found ways to innovate around where there are challenges and be able to deliver the reliable system. And to your credit, as you've noted, New England has avoided the major outages, and we hope that that continues based on the things that are being done. And ultimately, we'd like to eliminate maybe some of the innovation and get back to a more true North Star approach out of the economic textbook, but we're not there today. And one of the issues that we continue to wrestle with, and you've identified a bunch of them, but transmission planning is no easy task in New England either. It's tough nationally. It's certainly no easier for you, maybe more difficult in certain places. But as you've thought about planning and siting and some of the things we've been talking about with innovations you've had to come up with as workarounds, are there permitting and siting experiences that you maybe want to share that would be helpful for other regions, or maybe our federal policymakers, as we are in the middle of some, as we're recording, there's an ANOPR that's been sent from DOE to FERC that's talking about interconnection to large loads. And one of the issues that they're addressing is how do we connect faster? How do we make this process work more smoothly? So you may want to finish with that end, but are there things on the transmission side that we ought to be thinking about that you've either got the scars from or you've got the successes that you'd like to point towards?
I'll start with another first mover from a New England perspective is we got out of the starting blocks very quickly with regard to setting up a system for regionalizing in the cost of reliability investments. We started this journey back in 2002, 2003, and in the space of a decade, it had launched an investment portfolio that turned out to be close to $14 billion of investment in the transmission system, with the consequence that we have the least congested transmission system in the nation right now. It brought with it lots of efficiencies and advantages. It was expensive. Let's not shy away from that. Added 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour to the retail rate, but it massively reduced congestion on the system and the need for reliability agreements. We went down this path, and in fact also the capacity market path, because of the fact that we were so reliant on these reliability agreements with generators that were in load pockets. So we built our way out of that situation. In doing so, allowed the turnover of the fleet. So if you look at what happened in New England, we've had all this investment come in, but there also was a lot of stuff that retired, and we were able to manage that retirement quite easily because we had built out the transmission system. Otherwise, you get stuck. So if you don't have the transmission in place, you end up getting stuck, and you end up having to retain resources that you would otherwise want to let go. So
that efficiency of entry and exit is distorted.
Right. Can be a major friction. So the lack of sufficient transmission capability can be a major friction. So investing in transmission is absolutely essential from a reliability point of view and from an economic efficiency point of view. And that brought all kinds of benefits. Cost efficiencies, emissions dropped as we turned over the fleet. Then we got stuck for quite a while because we didn't have a comparable mechanism effectively regionalizing the cost of what was needed in order to scale the grid to meet public policy goals. So for a long time, we couldn't find a solution to how do we devise a solution that the states would support and have them be confident that they have decisional control over these investments as we scale up the grid. And just to take a step back for a moment, the ISO doesn't set policy. We're just operating a system, try and price reliability and achieve reliability through the market. So when you have an external policy goal which says we now want to decarbonize the system, one needs to have a way of paying for the renewables that come onto the system, but you also need to have a way of scaling up the transmission system to deal with the increased demand that will come from electrification and the increased investment that will be required in order to integrate all the renewables. And given the success that we had with regard to the reliability build out, some of the scar tissue that then came along was we spent too much money on the transmission system. We gold plated the transmission system, right? And so there was some reluctance to just let us go off and have decisional authority. And so for us, the breakthrough was some 6 years ago, we said, you know what, why don't we have the states be in charge of that? We'll be their consultants. we'll be the planners. We'll run the studies for them. We will tell them pros and cons are of different transmission investment strategies, and we'll work with them to do the RFPs for procuring the new transmission, but ultimately we'll set up the governance around this to make clear that we will not spend $1 on transmission for public policy unless they sign off.
Right.
So that resulted in two big steps forward for us. One was we made massive investments in our modeling capabilities to understand how the system was going to evolve over the next 30 or 40 years, both from a resource mix point of view, as well as from a transmission point of view. You can't know where your transmission investment should go unless you've got a fair idea of where your resources are going to come
Right,
from.
exactly. You're going to build a different system if you think you're having a different set of resources.
To do a good job on understanding the options, one needs to have good modeling capabilities. So we made a big investment in our modeling capabilities. And if you can do something about regulating demand at the right times, you can save a lot of money in both transmission as well as investment in the generation resources. And then we eventually looked across at what MISA was doing with their multi-value projects. The states liked that idea. So we formed a working group between the ISO and the states. And we designed what's now known as the long-term transmission planning process. And in doing so, we came up with a cost-benefit methodology that effectively has multiple factors to it. But if the cost benefit is greater than one, the states have agreed to regionalize the cost of these investments. If the ratio is below one, those states who still want to proceed, then it's up to them as to whether they want to fund that transmission. But it's been a breakthrough for us because it really undid the logjam that we had on building out the transmission system in order to achieve public policy goals. And I think it took us a while to get there. But we have a solution in place right now that is very promising. So we're doing our first RFP to sort of break through the bottleneck between New England, northern New England, and southern New England. In a way, it's going to look a little bit like what Texas did with the CREAs, 10, 15 years ago. So we're going to build a transmission path up to northern Maine to enable a bunch of land-based wind up in northern Maine. And so there's an example of this. You can find a way to collaborate with the states and have them also be willing to create a partnership around this. You can end up with a successful solution, and ultimately all our market participants supported this as well because it's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, and I think you've identified getting some skin in the game is particularly helpful to trying to get agreement. It's much easier to stand outside the tent and take shots at those inside the tent. When you're required to be in the tent, it sharpens the focus a bit.
If everybody feels like they have some ownership of the outcome, then there's an incentive there to work together.
That's exactly right. So we want to focus on winter a little bit because we're almost there. And New England, of course, is always one of the places that deals with winter more than some of the southern states and other parts of the country. And as we've already talked, you've navigated really well through a number of winter challenges. But we know that your winter outlook isn't yet released, but I know you're working on that. So as we head into the winter, what steps do you all take at the ISO to prepare for extreme cold or the prolonged winter events? You've talked about some of the market tools that are there, and I know every region has, well, we prep and we engage with stakeholders, and these are the steps that we take. But what's New England do so that people kind of have an understanding about how you're thinking about winter and how we ensure system reliability through what is the most stressful part of the year for the system in New England?
It's a very elaborate process. It's mostly housed in the operations area in terms of them preparing for the winter time. We talked earlier about the energy constraints in New England. Right. We learned way back when, more than 20 years ago, that the gas isn't always there when we want it to be there, and that we have to get through extended cold snap periods by relying on stored fuels. And the first problem we had was we didn't have visibility on what the storage level was on all of those fuels, right? And so we had to develop a system for understanding where we were day to day effectively on the inventory on stored fuels, made more complex by the fact that some of the storage is outside of the region in Canada, and the owners of those resources do not share with us how much fuel they've got in the tank. So we had to go back and track every cargo into that facility and every bit of gas that came out of that facility since it was put into operation to come up with a way of estimating how much fuel is in that tank, because it's a major input into the fuel.
Sure, that's quite a homework project.
Yeah, so we did that and it became very systematic, and we just do that now as a matter of course. And what we also came up with was a rolling 21-day energy forecast, which I still think we're the only ones in the nation doing this, because we need to understand where the energy is coming from. Where do we think it's going to come from? Is it going to be electrical energy coming across the ties? Is it going to be gas energy coming across the pipelines, or is it going to be a cold snap for the next week and we can't rely on the pipelines, we have to rely on the stored fuels? And so that energy inventory has to be updated on a rolling basis. And the reason we do it on a 21-day look-ahead basis is not only for our own comfort and operational planning, but also so that we can share it with the marketplace. Because the earlier you can give the marketplace notice of the fact that there's a constraint coming, the more time you're giving them to make preparation for that event and get themselves positioned to be able to supply the energy. And this is particularly important in the context of the incentives that we've created, the pay for performance incentives, now the same call option incentives that are embedded within the ancillary services market. So the more notice you can give the market, the better chance you've got of actually getting through the event intact.
Because it gives the market participants an opportunity to respond.
Exactly. We then became even more sophisticated. We partnered with EPRI to develop something called the probabilistic energy adequacy tool that looks on a probabilistic basis at all the various energy inputs, looks at weather, and does a Monte Carlo simulation on outcomes and identifies the tail events. Because it's the tail events that catch you by surprise, right? So you can look at Winter Storm Uri or Winter Storm Elliott and say those were tail events. And so what you want is as much situational awareness on those tail events and what the consequences could be as possible. And I mentioned to you earlier on, one of the things we worked through our stakeholder process on was to set up this regional energy shortfall threshold so that we can create a well-defined metric for operations to say, once we go beyond a certain point, we want the marketplace to know that there's risk beyond a certain point, which will cause us to start taking early operating actions. One of the things we all understand is once the operator starts stepping into the market, you start creating price distortions in the market.
Yep.
So ideally, you would want the market operator never to do that. You'd want the market to always solve for the reliability requirement. But if there are constraints that are going to create the need for the operator to start saying, we got to call for conservation, for example, because 2 weeks from now, we're going to have a problem.
Right.
You want there to be some systematic way of doing that. The market understands why the system operator is doing that and that it's against the definable metric, which is why we've created the REST metric. In the future, maybe the REST metric can be embodied within the market design in some way. There's another podcast out there about the inadequacy of today's reliability metrics relative to where we're going. But I think we've set ourselves up to have that next conversation about how does one evolve the market design in conjunction with evolving the reliability metrics that are needed for the system that we're trying to build out for the next 20 years.
Yep. And I think that's conversation that will be had at a great level of detail in all the markets. I think, as you said, sometimes you're on the leading edge and you're providing insights for others to follow, and sometimes others are wrestling with it from their own perspective. So we'll kind of see how that shakes out. As we talk about policy and thinking about winter and resource adequacy, there's a lot of change happening at the federal level right now that's having an impact, or it's frankly running counter to what a number of the New England states' goals are for, call it offshore wind or solar, electric vehicles, all of the things that you're trying to account for as you do planning. How do you try to calibrate for or incorporate that growing uncertainty? And you can take this from either side of the equation, demand or supply, but as electrification in New England likely continues to rise, how is the ISO thinking about how to manage both the supply and demand piece when you're facing policy decisions that have a direct impact on what's available for you to deploy as part of your resource adequacy?
I'll just take what you said for a moment. How does the ISO manage supply and demand? I think that's part of the problem here with the wholesale market constructs around the nation, which is the ISOs are running spot markets. They're setting up incentives to have supply respond and demand respond. They cannot guarantee a response either from supply or demand. So that means other actors have to take action in order for there to be good outcomes. Where the ISO can help, and I'll come back to the modeling capability. So there are many uncertainties that have been injected into the equation. New England, I think, thought it had a plan for moving forward with the clean energy transition. It was very much based on decarbonizing other sectors of the economy, electrification and transportation, by using emission-free electricity. Mm-hmm. And the bulk of the emission-free electricity was going to come from offshore wind, supplemented by land-based wind and solar, right? And so what now has happened is that the offshore wind industry has been disrupted. It was already in trouble, but now with the policy changes from the current administration, it's been disrupted. And so it raises the question of where is the supply coming from? So that's the question. The other part of it, the new supply is only needed if there's a continued increase in demand. So the other question it raises is, will the states continue to want to keep their foot on the accelerator with regard to electrification? We don't know the answers to these questions. But what we can do is be helpful in terms of modeling the what-if scenarios.
Yeah.
So going back to the modeling tools in terms of saying, here are the implications if we change this variable. Here are the implications if we change that variable. The PEAT analysis, which is if we drive demand harder than supply is capable of coming on, or we have retirements that occur too quickly, here are going to be the adverse outcomes. So I think from an educational point of view, we can help policymakers and the marketplace understand the consequences. And in doing so, we can play a productive role of having people understand what they can do in order to avoid the adverse outcomes. It also allows us to give people information around what's the trajectory on pricing. Because one of the things we know is that once supply becomes constrained or supply and demand come into balance, you're going to end up with more volatility on price. And the more we can give people notice on that, the more time people have to decide what to do about it. Which is one of the reasons earlier this year I was trying to say to folks, look, we don't want to end up having a conversation 3 or 4 years from now saying, this is a terrible outcome, prices have gone crazy, why didn't you tell us? But we also don't want to be alarmist about this because we don't know the future in detail. Nobody knows the future because we're not controlling all the variables. Nobody's controlling all the variables. So it's how do we as a region sort of walk this road together hand in hand, and we play our part and then we encourage others to play their part. So that's the way we're thinking about it. I said in our comments earlier this year, we're okay for now. Luckily, we haven't had a huge demand growth in this region. We're still at the early stages of the electrification demand growth, but it is happening and we see it happening. There are some things that are coming on that are helping and some things are hurting. So the loss of the offshore wind has hurt us in the longer run. It's not hurt us in the short run because it was a resource we were relying on in the longer run. We now have a new transmission line from Quebec coming into operation this winter, the NECC line, that's 1,200 megawatts. So that's something that is going to help. So for now, we're okay, but I think the risks are on the horizon. And I would say by the time we get to the turn of the next decade, we see the system becoming more stretched. And the thing that's a little worrying is if we look at all the regions around us, it's the same trajectory, right? So I think that's the national issue. So if you were a federal agency like the DOE or the FERC, that's got to be worrying them because the whole system is systematically getting tighter and tighter. And so then that leads to another set of issues, which is, are we all collectively using the right metrics to measure reliability?
I mean, you've identified the importance of being a truth teller, right? You don't have skin in the game in a financial perspective, but look, I can provide you the information and inform you about what the impacts will be on investment decisions or policy choices. And I'll administer the best market I possibly can, but we need you to understand what the implications are. And I think that's a role for all of the RTO ISOs around the country is be the neutral arbiter and share the information. Policymakers are free to follow your counsel or ignore it, as they often do. But you're delivering some of the critically important pieces of data that I think people need to rely on so that they can get the outcome they want. It may not be on the time horizon that they prefer, but at the end of the day, you are providing invaluable information that should be informing some of these policy decisions. And that's true at the state, region, and national level. I think that's true across the board.
The thing about it is the more forewarning you can give for people, the higher the probability that you don't get into that situation. The worst outcomes are when people are surprised.
100%.
And so the thing we've learned along the way is to try and take the surprise out of the equation. And then that not only helps people do the right things to avoid the adverse outcome, it also helps us because we never have to get into the situation of having to ration electricity, which is what rolling blackouts are all about. So that's just going to be a lose-lose for everyone.
Yep, agreed. So we haven't really talked about them much. We've talked around them, but the consumers are vitally important, right? They're the ones at the end of the day that we're trying to serve, that you're trying to make sure you can move power to from where it's generated to where it's ultimately consumed. And sometimes, as I like to say, people want 3 things: lights on, beer cold, water warm. They don't necessarily care where and how, but when they hit the light switch, they want it to work. And that's ultimately all of our obligation, and we aim for that. But how would you talk to consumers that are, as you talked about before, the modest price increases people can absorb? It's the volatility and the big spikes that get people's attention. and can lead to bad outcomes. How would you better explain to the average consumer these price signals and reliability are connected? There is a relationship that exists, and you're the beneficiary ultimately. But if we don't make investments today, it's going to lead to higher costs tomorrow. So, if you're a Popeye fan, it's the do you want your hamburger today or I'll take two tomorrow problem. You pick your analogy. We can use whatever one you prefer. But how do we make sure consumers understand the impacts of what you're trying to achieve, what we're trying to do, and ultimately how it affects their wallet? Because in the end, as a recovering politician, those kitchen table issues are what move voter behavior. And so they're electricity consumers, but they're going to pull the lever on a ballot at some point. How should we be talking to consumers about this so that they're best informed, knowing that they've got a whole bunch of other things that they're focused on? But this is an issue that continues to draw public scrutiny. If you're looking at the New Jersey governor's race right now, this is the number one issue, is electricity prices.
Yeah, so it's a very difficult thing for an ISO or an RTO to be communicating directly to retail end use consumers. ISOs and RTOs, I think, for the most part, are pretty abstract concepts, if they even are on the radar screen.
Yeah, if anybody knows who you are.
Anybody knows what you are. People know more about air traffic control at the airport than they do about ISOs and RTOs.
That's a good point.
So ISOs and RTOs are these, if you've heard of them, they are these sort of mysterious things that are controlled by the federal government that don't necessarily result in good outcomes for end consumers. That
Sure.
what the average end consumer think of them if they know anything about them at all. So really the audience for ISOs and RTOs are the next level up from those end consumers. They're representatives.
Yeah, the policymakers.
The policymakers, they're elected representatives in states, the federal regulators, the federal policymakers, the state regulators. And so I'll come back to something I said earlier on. The more we can do to educate them about the implications of the choices they're making, the more we can help them educate the retail end consumers. And I think the same would apply to the media as well. So there's lots of people who like to write about the stuff that we do. This podcast is an example of that. And so helping educate people to say, look, here are the few scenarios about where we're going in the future.
Mm-hmm.
One of the common themes about all of these scenarios is that we need to invest in infrastructure. Because to your earlier point, you want your beer cold, you want the water warm, you want your internet up and running, right?
Yeah.
And so to make that happen with increased demand on the system, then you can throw in all the other things that one wants to achieve. For example, decarbonization. You need to make investment. And I think the average consumer is going to understand the need for investment, whether it be in roads,
Sure.
potholes, or rail infrastructure. They'll understand the need for investment. They just not going to want to have it be a price shock that they haven't planned for. That's where the hedging comes back in again.
Yeah.
I think the educational side of things vitally important. And the thing we've learned, I'd say in the last decade, more than the earlier part of the journey, was the absolute necessity of having good modeling tools, excellent communication staff that can work with the folks that are doing the modeling to translate these complex concepts into something that's understandable. And once you get there, then I think people start having more productive conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think no one's sort of blaming the ISO in New England for the gas constraints.
Right.
Right? Because we've put so much effort into modeling and explaining what that's all about. I just noticed a big shift in the conversation around how do we plan the system for them. And our part of this is the transmission planning.
Mm-hmm.
But, the states have a huge role in terms of steering the resource mix.
Correct.
And so we're doing a lot of economic analysis. If you go look at what we've been doing in the last 5 or 6 years, there's something called EPSA, Economic Planning for the Clean Energy Transition. We've just released another set of studies around the economics of the change in resource mix. We'll be saying to folks, look, if we do this, it's going to result in the following cost outcomes. If we do that, you can actually reduce costs dramatically. And that then is a positive and constructive feedback into the policymaking debate as to, well, where do we want to steer things in order to moderate the impact on energy? And one of the things that we have been, I'll just use this as an example, which I think has been a disappointing outcome in New England over the last 25 years, there's still not really much in the way of dynamic retail demand response, right? And so, but we've shown through our economic studies, you can take demand off the system at the right time. You can dramatically reduce the investment. So that has caused positive feedback into the policy making discussion, where the states are working group to say, how do we set up some kind of standardized retail price responsive system from a retail perspective? And so I think we ultimately can't control because we have jurisdiction about what's happening at the retail level.
Correct.
But what we can do is continue to educate. To me, that's the only role we can play, because ultimately other people in the swim lanes next to us are going to have to make decisions to try and shape consumer behavior, as well as get consumers to understand why we're spending money where we're spending.
Right. Yeah. What innovation or what, and you can take this in any direction you want, technology, markets, regulatory, what have you, gives you the most optimism about where we are, but really where we're going? Because we are in somewhat of a transformative period in the load growth forecasts and investment, and the build cycle appears to be upon us. What gives you the most optimism or the most hope about the successful delivery of power on the future grid, whatever that looks like? And you can choose your time horizon, but hopefully there's 2 or 3 things that you feel optimistic about. I'm always interested to know where people are feeling like we're trending in a good direction because, and whatever that because might be from your seat.
I think we're in the time now where we're having really tough conversations about the scaling of the grid and how best to accomplish the integration of big quantities of new demand on the grid. And it feels very turbulent and some very messy discussion right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's necessary. And so I am optimistic that as we grapple with this, solutions will start emerging. And there's the old adage that necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah.
So, we've seen that play out in New England, and I think we're going to see that play out at the national level as well. There'll be much debate about what comes out of that and whether or not it fits the economic textbook or not. But I am optimistic that this is a nation that is not going to let the lights go out.
Absolutely not.
Right? It's not going to let the lights go.
Yeah.
The consequences are too great. And so it's going to feel a little bit chaotic at times, but I think we're going to figure solutions out region by region to keep the lights on.
Mm-hmm.
So then I just say that from a sort of a general high-level policy point of view. Second thing I'd say is there's continual evolution on both the supply side and the demand side. And we're going to see that play out in response to the need that's out there. You look at how far the innovation in shale gas has carried us in the last 2 decades, right? And that was a massive innovation. It brought down the cost of electricity. I can see that is still going to play a big role. But looking forward, obviously, there's a demand for emissions-free electricity as well. And we see it being expressed at different levels in society. All the folks that are putting in the data centers also want emission-free because they don't want to say to their consumers, their customers, hey, we're creating a bunch of emissions while we're doing your ChatGPT search, right?
Right.
So they're looking for emissions-free solutions as well. And there's a huge amount of investment going into that. The renewables came a long way in the last decade and a half. So we know that's a solid proposition. And I think you can go a long way to marrying renewables with conventional technology and put carbonized. Right? And lots of money going into SMR. So I'm optimistic about SMRs in the long run. I'm cautious about them in the short run. So I hear a lot of enthusiasm about SMRs, and I would say you got to work the bugs out and the economics have got to work.
Right.
But if you look at the New England context for a moment, if we assume that offshore wind has been set back a decade, more or less, and the first SMRs are coming online by the end of this decade, it's plausible that by the middle of the next decade, efficiencies are starting to come into focus for SMRs. And if those technologies are cost effective compared to offshore wind, New England might have other options. But there has been already a discussion. I see it happening at the state level around maybe SMR and so the way to go in the future. And we've done some modeling which show that if one had cost-effective SMRs, it would be a real advantage in terms of overall cost efficiency. So I'm cautiously optimistic about that as one technology. We've got our first long-duration storage technology surfacing in the system in the form of the iron oxide batteries.
Yes.
But I'm also optimistic that over time we will see other long-duration storage technologies come into focus as well. So I think as long as there's a demand, and there's clearly a demand, we're going to find people inventing new solutions here. That's the power of the wholesale market construct as well. To the extent that investors believe that they can access the market directly and compete to provide a service, they will be inclined to do so. If you try and re-regulate the system and put it all back in the hands of a few entities, that you might stifle that innovation.
Right.
And so, once again, the pitch for maintaining the wholesale market structure, with all the caveats I mentioned earlier on, I'm optimistic that this is a creative country. We will find ways to address these issues.
That's kind of what we're known for globally, is that we try to innovate and invent, and I'm confident we'll continue to do that. So let me close our conversation, Gordon, with a question that is probably the $64,000 question for those old enough to remember that show. What is the single biggest lesson that you would share with stakeholders, with your peers, with policymakers about running a reliable grid? There are clearly a lot of things that we've spent the last hour plus talking about, but if you had to boil it down to the one thing that you said, this is what you all need to grasp onto as we think about delivering for the next 40 years, what would that be?
First would be my advice to Vamsi, who's going to be my successor, and anyone else after him, which is the thing I've learned is the power of having good people. I was asked at a conference last year, what is the thing I was proudest of? And I would say it's the team that we built here at ISO New England. So if you've got great people, they will do great things for you. Right. And they will innovate. I think having a group of people that are capable, and as long as you listen to a diverse set of views and don't make decisions on the fly, I think you'll end up with good outcomes. From a policy point of view, I think the importance of there being policy alignment around the wholesale market construct is fundamentally important. So if you have in a multi-state region, states pulling in opposite directions, or in a bifurcated regulatory system such as we have in the United States, where you have the federal agencies in charge of one part and the states in charge of another part, if there's a lack of alignment there, that's not a great context for achieving good outcomes. It sounds a little bit like I'm preaching from the pulpit here.
We gave you the floor. We want you to do that.
I think if you can't get alignment between federal and state policy, then you have to get alignment between state policy, sufficient alignment. You're never going to achieve 100% alignment. That's just not realistic.
Right.
But in multi-state environments, you have to find a way of working together. And I think to give New England credit, being a small region forever, it will always be a small region. People understand that they have to work together. The economies of scale, power system are such that people really can't afford to go their own way. And so I think that's what forced us to work together in this region. And I would say by learning that is an important message to transfer to anyone else who's willing to listen. If you have a single state jurisdiction, it's even easier.
Right.
But it's the multi-state, multi-tiered regulatory structure where things become more complicated.
Yeah, you may have a future career in trying to arbitrate between states. Since you've had 25 years of doing it, I can think of at least one region that could maybe use some help getting their states to get into alignment. So with that, Gordon, I want to thank you for taking time to visit with us, and certainly thank you for the work that you've done at ISO New England over the last quarter of a century. It's certainly appreciated, if sometimes not recognized, and we certainly want to pay you the compliment of the great work that you've done there. So Gordon, thanks so much for being with us. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you, Todd. I enjoyed the conversation.
That was Gordon van Welie, CEO of ISO New England, reflecting on 25 years of innovation and lessons that extend far beyond one region. His message is simple but powerful. When policies align, markets work. And that's how we keep the grid reliable, affordable, and resilient. Thanks for listening. You can learn more about these issues on our website at EPSA.org and follow us on social media on X at EPSA News and LinkedIn. The music for this podcast is produced by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Be sure to subscribe and join us next time on Energy Solutions.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, bringing about 200,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. The music in this episode is written, produced, and performed by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.